Anna's ministry. We had given them the opportunity to think about the circumstances of this church, to think about justice together, and they didn't ask a single question other than, do you stand by these statements? I wish I could share the experience of being in that room, because Anna was incredible. It was clear they were just going to sort of go through things quickly, and Anna went through sentence by sentence these statements and said, yeah, do I still celebrate my queerness? Absolutely. Am I still celebrating the love known with my partner, which is sexual and emotional and supportive in all varieties of ways? Yes. Anna went line by line and represented the truth. And that was it. That's all we have, is the truth. And they have their sad eyes. So, yeah, I've been struggling lately, feeling overwhelmed by the sense that it does not matter how good we are, how strong our arguments are, how grounded we are in the gospel. It does not matter how much people say they love us. We are still left arguing for how our lives and our work matter, and we are still met with sad eyes, and that is making me sad. And I know for myself, I need to find a way out of that. So on the one hand, when this protocol came out, I thought, maybe this could happen, and I just want this to be over. I just want this to be over. And yet, on the other hand, part of me thinks that it is time just to burn it all to the ground. Because what kind of church sees people who are crying out in pain, who are naming the harm and the complicity and the duplicity, who are calling the church to make good news real, and that church responds by saying, hold on, trust the process, don't act out, you're hurting your own cause. Yeah, a corrupt church. We hear, we have to be bishops for everyone, and we know what that means. We know that we are not included in the everyone. And so, it's time that we be real and name the intersections of injustice that have been going on for decades. So my experience is of queer oppression in this church, but what we have been doing to queer and trans people in the UMC is not disconnected from whole histories of oppression. There has been good historical work done recently identifying how anti-queer sentiment, along with anti-abortion the early Christian community. And we might be inclined to say, no, there are other ways that Paul clearly acknowledges that enslaved people are part of the community. Sure, there were enslaved people, and it seems there's been some great recent scholarship by Catherine Shaner that highlights the religious leadership of enslaved people in the ancient world. And yet, this is a problem. This is one of those issues where the generic ideal isn't enough. To say we value a sexual ethic that shuns fornication popular. They would tell the stories of apostles in these fantastical ways so to set forth a model, to say, Andrew, this is someone you should follow. And in the Acts of Andrew, he, like Paul, is teaching celibacy. And there's this free woman, Maximilla, who's a leech. She's married to a Roman acknowledged that there might be times that it would be legitimate for an enslaved person to run away. They said if a slave is being abused extremely, they could run away for a time to get a sort of break, to appeal to another free person on their behalf. But obviously the assumption is they must return to their owner. Okay, if we keep in mind that enslaved people could flee extreme circumstances of abuse, and if Paul is saying, flee porneia, and an enslaved person might learn from that, their sexual exploitation is something to run away from. And if that's possible, if the running away is possible, then it was always possible to say, dang, that's bad. Like, okay, we have enslaved people running away from their abuse, their exploitation. One option is to see that and say, maybe we should stop the abuse. Of course, that's not the option that was taken. And I like to look back to the ancient world because we make these sorts of excuses to say slavery was so saturated in the ancient mindset they couldn't have imagined thinking of an alternative, as if we are so much more enlightened. But what are we doing? The same patterns of seeing violence called out, of seeing violence, spiritual abuse, exploitation of all manner is all around us, and we see it both like in front of us, and also we hear people calling out for justice, calling for release from the captives, calling for the end of an exploitative, abusive, new form of slavery with mass incarceration. Like, these are the sorts of things that 100 years from now people might say, well, they couldn't have known. Their lives were so tied up in incarceration, they couldn't have thought differently. But we can think differently because we see around us that people know the truth. We just won't pay attention to it. So when we read the Bible, when we think about the ancient enslaved, I want us to think maybe they knew something more than Paul. Maybe when we read Paul and we read this sexual ethic, we might think there was always an alternative that was possible, and that alternative that was possible was to reject, to flee, to run away from problematic, immoral, exploitative sex, and to claim ownership over one's own body. That idea has always been possible, and we do a disservice to ancient people, but we do a disservice to ourselves when we don't take that seriously. When we think, well, what do we do? What do we do? We can't imagine how to move forward. We form commissions on ways forward, and we don't move forward because we're so tied up in these systems that we can't extricate ourselves from. And this is why I end up being both so disturbed, because I've been a part of so many conversations where the look on the other side is, we hear you, we're sorry for you, but we can't imagine a different way, even as we're literally saying, here's a different way. I've seen that so often, and that disturbs me. But then what astonishes me is to realize those moments of connection, of solidarity that come in knowing the truth and in claiming that truth together, whatever it costs us, and it does cost so much. And so through the experience of complaints with Anna, who has been such an inspiration to me and so many, I have tried to learn from that to pay greater and greater attention, because someone is always telling the truth that we need to hear, and it might make us uncomfortable, and it might even make us ashamed. There are times that I get to be on the stage, so I get to venerate Anna. Anna would talk about a sort of back and forth, but there were times I would find my own self thinking, I feel like maybe we should slow down. Maybe we should do this differently. Maybe we should think about this in another way. We're coming on too strong. And then I would feel that deep connection and kinship with Anna, and I would feel the power in just naming the truth. And I felt my own histories of a lifetime of working in the closet and then out of the closet and needing to unlearn some of these systems of oppression that I had sort of internalized as well, internalized homophobia. And in that experience of being together, of working to tell truth together, of mutual accountability, which is mutual responsibility and mutual care for one another, in that sort of back and forth, I am certain that I have experienced a foretaste of the kingdom that is to come. And so that is what I want to leave you with. The recognition that when we pay attention enough to be disturbed, that then we can keep seeking and realize what might amaze us, which is that there is truth and there is power already within us or within others that we can learn from and step up. And then when we step up together, we can, in the language of the Gospel of Thomas, rule the all. But I think the idea here is to be grounded in the truth, and the truth is power, and the truth of the gospel is that we are made for connection with one another, for connection with all of God's creation, with our earth, and so too with connection with the divine. And so may we pay enough attention to be disturbed when we need to be disturbed, to be amazed by the power of kinship and solidarity, and to seek that power which is power together, and that is the power of the truth that each of us is a reflection of God. And so I thank you for this opportunity to witness with you, to share some of my own experiences and to share some from the ancient world in order that we might collaborate and think together. And so I think we have 17, 18 minutes for some question and answer or responses. So I'm interested to hear from you, to think together. I'm sorry to have talked so much and not to have left more time, so I'm happy to continue talking over the course of this gathering. Does anyone have a question they want to shout out? While we work out the mic situation?
Yeah, I'll shout it out and I'll be pretty loud. It was interesting when you were talking about Paul, because one of the things I've been reflecting on is thinking about Paul's status of having Roman citizenship, and if that sort of made him a privileged, sort of looking at him as a privileged apostle, having that status that others didn't have, and that making him more willing to make the concessions because he was, the viewpoint he had, he almost couldn't look from the viewpoint of others. Yes, he was thrown in jail. Yes, he was doing all these things, but he always had that card to kind of pull out of his pocket. Oh, by the way, I'm a citizen. And it got him out of a lot of things. So there's a certain air that he's able to carry. And I was wondering, interactions with that is, because I've been looking for articles too to try and see if there's discourse on this kind of subject.
Yeah, one connection I'd actually make is less in terms of the Roman citizenship, but more in terms of Paul's engagement with Rome. And there's been some good work in the last few decades in Pauline scholarship. Joseph Marshall is someone who talks about the ways that Paul is both a sort of resistant to the imperial structures, because while he seems to have been, perhaps was a citizen, he also was sort of trying to get together this movement under Roman Empire, and so was doing things in terms of strategy, I think we could call them strategy, that were to try to protect early Christians from being too suspicious and to raise the ire of the Romans. So there are ways that there seem to be subtle hints of actually imagining alternative forms of power and relationality, but at the same time, Paul kind of plays it safe. And I think, so for instance, in Corinth, this is one of my favorite texts to study, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, because Paul is clearly anxious over disruption within the community, and his worry is that the sort of disruption that's happening, there seems to have been a fight, and the fight seems to have at least been based on gender. So it seems in Corinth there was a strong group of women prophets who were claiming their authority and power in God, and that this caused disruption in the community, especially men who were wondering, like, wait a minute, what about these women who we're supposed to be able to have sex with? Like, we're supposed to have control over them, and now they're saying they don't want to marry, they don't want to have sex. And so Paul's making concessions in Corinthians to say, well, let's just find a balance. We know you're passionate about your prophetic commitment to Christ, but also that's becoming too disruptive to the Romans, and if we become too disruptive, they're going to say, because the Romans value peace and order, an ordered, managed peace, they'll say, we'll come in and squash you. And so I think Paul's making some concessions in that way that I sort of get. And so I think my answer is in some ways a little weird, because in this way it's like I find myself sort of getting why Paul's making some concessions. It's like he's actually worried, even though he has some privilege within the empire as a free person. He seems to be worried about what might happen if the Romans come and quell this movement. So he's like, let's just stay calm, not raise too much suspicion in our communities. And yet, what's the sacrifice of that? The sacrifice is that it was always possible to have had a version of Christianity that from its start valued women as leaders. That is a part of the Corinthian correspondence, but that's on the other side. Those are the letters we don't have, the witness of women who were standing up, who were probably saying to Paul, don't sell us out. We learned this. We learned this. We learned the empowerment of Christ from and with you, and you're selling us out. And so these are the sorts of moments, too, that like I find myself sort of getting what Paul's doing and also sort of getting what bishops and leaders are doing, because they're afraid. They're like, this is all going to fall apart. But what's the consequence? It has all fallen apart. Like, it has all fallen apart.
shine, let it shine, oh, let it shine, let it shine. Jesus, give it to me, I'm gonna let it shine. Jesus, give it to me, I'm gonna let it shine. Jesus, give it to me, I'm gonna let it shine, oh, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, oh, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, oh, let it shine, let it shine. For justice and peace, I'm gonna let it shine. For justice and peace, I'm gonna let it shine. For justice and peace, I'm gonna let it shine, oh, let it shine, let it shine. Guguji chanagi, hayayi tatis. Guguji chanagi, hayayi tatis. Guguji chanagi, hayayi tatis. Gugigas, gugigas, gugigas. Tutguji motashi, hayayi tatis. Tutguji motashi, hayayi tatis. Tutguji motashi, hayayi tatis. Gugigas, gugigas, gugigas. No matter what people say or think about me, I am a child, I am a child of God. No matter what people say
Oh, my bad. He told me. I didn't. I don't know how. It was late last night. I don't know. I know. My bad. No. That's fine.
And there is nothing that can separate you from the truth that you're someone, you are family, you are meant to be a child, a child.
I'm sorry.
You have 3 more mics.
Well, they took channels here.
No matter what the world says, precision's transmits on you. You are a child. You are a child of God. No matter what the world says, just nonsense on me. I am a child. I am a child of God. And there is no one, nothing that can separate you from the truth that you're someone, you are family, you are meant to be a child, a child.
And as the song is winding down, we hope everybody will come back together and we're going to restart up with the next portion of our program. All right. Thank you very much. So, first thing I'm going to do is apologize. And I've been told several times, and I didn't even realize until I was told that I did not actually introduce myself. I just got up here and started talking. And I feel like that's just an indictment on how comfortable I felt with all of you here. I got all these people that I know and love and care about, and all these like-minded people. So I was like, oh, everybody knows who I am. We're all cool. And I just started talking. So, my bad. My name is Adrian Hill. I am part of the Northern Illinois Conference Reconciling Task Force. So I work with everyone that you saw stand up earlier.
Exodus during what we call Shtimiskinanini, what you may have heard of the Trail of Tears. We were forcibly removed from our homeland, what's commonly colonially known as Alabama and Georgia today. And so the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference is what emerged in Indian Territory, what became known as Oklahoma, as a way to convert a bunch of indigenous peoples to Methodism. My fourth great-grandfather, 6 generations back, founded a Methodist church in the Creek Nation among Muskogee people. And my partner, who's sitting back there, her family has been involved in the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference for a bazillion generations. Her grandfather was a pastor, a Methodist minister. Her great-grandfather on her mom's side was a Methodist minister. Her great-great-grandfather on her paternal side was a Methodist minister and founder of a Methodist church. And her great-uncle on her mom's side was, and her dad's brother today is. So, like, for Muskogee people, being Methodist is also part of our heritage, at least for the last couple hundred years. And so we're trying to wrestle with what we're going to do. Our conference doesn't really know what direction we're going in, and I'm part of an intentional eco-village community in Alabama, and we've been tossing around whether or not we're going to have a congregation in our community that's a part of the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference if people can, like, rid themselves of queer phobia.
Hello. My name is Jonah. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm a trans person, a queer person, and a church planter. I am the lead pastor of Zao MKE Church. Zao is a Greek word. It's from the New Testament, and it means to be among the living. So I do ministry with my partner in Milwaukee, but I actually come Methodist-wise from Northern Illinois. I did not grow up United Methodist. Y'all caught me up in your vision in this iteration of the gospel, in the work of the Spirit. But I'm going to tell you a secret. I was not caught up by your committees. I did not catch the structure through the institution. And Lord knows I did not hear the gospel in Robert's Rules of Order.
It was the potluck.
I do remember potlucks.
Hot dish or
Actually,
casserole?
y'all, it was the church plants. Y'all know Urban Village Church? That's where I got connected to the Wesleyan tradition. That's when I first heard the terms personal holiness and social holiness paired together. That's where I first felt connected to a church that was doing something that really meant something to me that I could become a part of. That's when I first realized that if I wanted to be a part of a radical, liberating, queer-affirming church, I might have to be a part of building it. And so, by the good and faithful work of the United Methodists of the Northern Illinois Conference, who were church planting, who were doing the work of ministry, honestly, in many ways, before they ever got permission from not only the United Methodist Church, but their own Northern Illinois Conference, I got caught up in this vision. And I said yes to the invitation of the Holy Spirit and to God, and I was sent out. I don't know if you all know how many people you send out into the world to do church planting work, the work of building a new church in the vision of the gospel. But it's a lot. And I am so proud to be one of those. While I was at Urban Village, I was one of half a dozen who discerned a call to ministry and went off to seminary that year. Many of us are church planters across the country, and we stay in contact, and it's incredible to see what people are doing. For me, doing this ministry in Milwaukee is a part of living the truth of the gospel here and now, not waiting for the institution to catch up, but calling behind my shoulder every step of the way. And so, as a church planter, and as a queer person, and as a trans person, I haven't asked permission. I got asked by there was another clergy person in my conference who, through an enormous pressure campaign, an enormous, generations of pressure to be silenced, to be closeted. This person grew up in the institution, so didn't have some of the reckless freedom that I came in with, because I found y'all, I know the gospel is outside of the United Methodist Church as well. But this person that I was working with was closeted, separated from his husband, and in fear. And he asked me once, I don't understand why Some people get permission to be out, and some of us have to be closeted. And I told him, I didn't get special dispensation from my DS. I came out. Now that means bearing some of these
as a queer man, but who I do give thanks for Bishop Devinar for the appointment, right? The appointment to Union United Methodist Church in Boston, and the appointment year after year, which is a risk, right? Especially bishops and others who take that risk in a colonized system, right? That allow us to bear witness to the fullness of who we are. And so I give thanks for that expression in New England.
So Northern Illinois Conference became a reconciling conference in the 80s, right? So for a long time, as a conference, we have said, this is who we are. We are open and we are affirming. Broadway United Methodist Church has been actively involved in this work of justice for a long time too, and our conference leadership has allowed Broadway to be that voice. However, I do feel sometimes, but by trying to allow, they also almost left us alone. So that feels a little weird, where we feel, the members of Broadway Church feel like we are adopted children, or you know what I mean. So that's a little struggle, even though we were allowed to be the voice and do the things that Broadway has been involved in since the 80s, but we long for more active participation from our conference, which we now are getting, at least through our district superintendent. We are getting active participation. We have had our district superintendent present in our building more than ever before. So that speaks a lot. I also do understand that conferences are part of the institution. And the institution of our conference is doing what institutions do, which is to protect themselves, right? To prevent their existence. And so that I understand. That is the reality. That is what the conference as an institution is doing. That's what the institution did in 2019 by supporting the One Church Plan, and that is what the institution is doing now with the protocol. We will hear more about it, but that's what I wanted to focus on. Also, conferences at this point in the time of the life of our church can stop the harm. And you heard a lot from Reverend Tyler Schwaller what that could have looked like. But that's where I long for our conferences to become a little more vocal and clear on who we are as God's people, who we are as people who claim to be followers of Jesus, to actually follow Jesus and share the love of God with the people. I hope to find a conference like that soon.
I'll stand so all of you can see over here too. We're in a unique situation in OIMC because we share a bishop with the Oklahoma Conference. And if you all know, like, Oklahoma politics are usually pretty, I know some of y'all might be like live streaming this, so I'm a little nervous to say too much because there's a lot of political stuff that's going on. You know, indigenous peoples have largely been affected by evangelical fundamentalist Christianity that has infiltrated our communities. So sometimes when you walk into a United Methodist church in the OIMC, you can't tell the difference between the next door Baptist church and the next door Presbyterian church because everybody's singing from the Heavenly Highways hymnal. But power in the blood. But at the same time, we come from a tradition, most indigenous peoples come from a tradition of inclusivity with respect to what in our language we say, those who stand in the middle, which is kind of this broad queer category, which we value because one who stands in the middle can see multiple perspectives that people with more monolithic, straight thinking can't embrace. So everybody in Native communities has a queer relative, and that's because we have really intact genealogical structure. Our kinship web is very different from Western society, where people move away, you don't know your own relatives, right? You say, oh, that's a distant cousin when you share grandparents, siblings, or something like that. That's my second cousin or third cousin. We don't have terminology like this. One's a brother, a sister, an auntie, an uncle, and everybody knows their 15th cousins that you share a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparent with. And so this is really important because with these really intact kinship structures, everybody has a relative that is queer in some form. So we can't, we don't really pretend that this is something that we're exempt from. And I think a lot of white communities often think that, well, I can just, divorce myself from this person and I can stay in this bubble over here. But in OIMC, unfortunately, is something we don't really talk about, but we don't talk about full inclusion because we already sort of feel fully inclusive because every congregation has LGBTQ persons in it, and it's not really spoken of. But we are talking about becoming an independent conference, and that's also tied to a larger issue of white supremacy. But we don't know how that's going to go, and so I just want to kind of leave it there. But we have a conference superintendent, and then we have 2 DSs. But the conference superintendent, we started a fellowship, which my goal was to be the first reconciling fellowship in the OIMC about 8 years ago. And there wasn't support from the bishop, but our conference superintendent was supportive, and he regularly came to our services. Problem was we didn't have any Christians in it, but that's okay. And it was good. And so those of you that like to politic in the UMC too, with those of you that might know folks from South Central jurisdiction, our conference superintendent is going to be a candidate for bishop. So if you all could, politic around, get some votes over that way, I'll just leave it there.
So for me, I feel like I'm in a little bit of a strange space because I always feel like I've felt the tension of the benefits as well as the difficulty of large institutions. And I say that because I'm a product of the institution who has essentially encouraged me throughout my career, even into the present. So, for me, I was a member of Indiana Conference. There's not a lot of Asian folk, not a lot of non-white folk either. But I was encouraged every step of the way in my ministry. North Georgia, while I was there, because my spouse was doing PhD, not so much actually, but I was able to have an appointment there partly because of, if not large part, because of my bishop in Indiana giving a great recommendation. But my ability to come to New York to be a part of this progressive church plant was also because of the cabinet and the bishop of the New York Annual Conference, Tom Bickerton, who's also part of the protocol. And so there's always this weird tension because at no point was I really hindered in doing ministry, and yet there's always the tension of experiencing the sort of problems with, I don't even know exactly how to describe it, but there's things that kind of drag a bit, or kind of you wish like you could talk about certain things or be more active in support of certain things. And usually it's much more like, here, we'll let you do this and try not to be too involved. So it's kind of a general support as opposed to something more deeply personal. But at the same time, you know, we have gotten, as Jonah was talking about, you know, the conference did promise certain things, and from our perspective, those promises have been fulfilled, and so we're very grateful for that. You know, one thing that would be a need that I sometimes get concerned with, especially with regards to church plant, you know, is that I'm not as talented as Jonah is, and so you know we don't grow as quickly. But most church plants I found out don't, and so you know financial support is a very important part of all of these discussions. And I say that because I really do think that the future of the church at large, as well as the United Methodist Church, really is in church plants of some form. New community, and at the very least, taking on the mentality of what church planting is about. Because the reality is, not only is the institution sort of 20 to 30 to 40 years behind, the reality is, if we as a church want to continue to reach out to the community and share the love of God, we're going to have to do things differently. And so from that perspective, I think the conference, the United Methodist Church have to start shifting their views. And this is not a conservative, progressive thing. I found the same problem, regardless of where you're at and who the person is that we are slow to move our feet. And when that happens, the reality is non-white communities are the first to get left behind and first to lose support, and minority communities in particular. And so for me, you know, that's one of the concerns that I have, and that I wish that conference leadership would be very much more intentional about thinking ahead and supporting the communities, investing in communities that it's not going to be just like a 2-3 year, bam, you have like a thriving, 100-member, congregation going, but to really deeply invest. I know of a friend where she was doing great work, and in like a couple years, the promises weren't fulfilled to the end of it, and lost that traction that she was making within the community. And that's sad, because it's a very you support it with money, but if you're not thinking long term as well, then you're going to lose out, I think, on the fruit of those ministries that are starting. So hopefully I answered a little bit of the question.
All right. So, the next question. What are you most afraid of at this time in UMC? And what gives you hope that we can live into the liberating gospel of Jesus?
I'm most afraid of a failure of imagination, right? That we're so used to what we know and what's close to our heart. I'm an ordained United Methodist elder, right? And the United Methodist Church has gifted me in the same way that it has kind of cursed me. And I'm afraid in this moment that as people who are yearning for something more, that's caught up right in this new heaven and new earth, this vision that's recorded in Revelation, that we just continue to do the same thing over and over again. And it's happening, right? I mean, the protocol, how many have seen the paper or read the protocol? Show of hands. Right? Protocol. I mean, one church plan. You see that, and I mean, it's different in some ways, but it's still more of the same. Right? It's paying, it's funding the WCA to leave, even though we can't even trust that. because the whole premise of the protocol is that bishops will hold in abeyance these complaints until we unravel. And yesterday we saw the Bishop of Virginia say, not going to happen in her context. Other bishops have said the same thing, maybe just not as publicly. So this whole negotiation, right, which was a secret negotiation done behind closed doors by a group of people who weren't actually authorized by anyone to do it, led mostly by bishops who don't vote actually at General Conference and had promised to deliver the One Church plan in 2019 and actually failed to do that. Right, so already you see this protocol, which is being marketed by the entire institution through United Methodist Communications in a briefing, right, that had the support of the Council of Bishops. It actually got on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post because the press release went out to the Council of, from the Council of Bishops letterhead, right, with to their press contacts. So right, the entire system has been behind it, but at the same time saying it's just one plan like every others. I mean, we can't trust that. I'm the head of delegation from New England, right? So I'm deeply suspicious of these attempts to undermine the self-determination of the General Conference in ways that are disingenuous. Because it's saying it's just one other plan, but the Forward, we wrote the new plan, New Expressions Worldwide, which is actually a plan for dissolution, saying that this system that we're in is too fraught. We didn't get a press conference or or a briefing to publicize this work. So it's rotten in the way it's been positioned. And the last thing I'll say, because I know others got to say some things, is I understand why the mechanism is kind of getting behind the protocol. We're all tired, right? We've been doing this for decades, and we everybody wants to stop fighting. So we're exhausted by this fight. But I learned this as a student, learned it when I was doing my doctorate. Right, when I'm tired and try to write, I don't produce good work. Right, I don't trust myself when I'm tired to think clearly, to write clearly. So I'm very suspicious of a church that is taking attempts to go forward out of pure exhaustion. I don't think we can trust the process because it was done in behind closed doors in the dark when we follow Jesus, the light of the world, just coming after Epiphany. And so the new plan, which we're proposing, actually offers a plan for dissolution, but it says the negotiations will be done through a transitional council that happens in the light, so we can all hold each other accountable to the work and not count on these backroom deals by unauthorized people who actually don't represent the breadth of the church, actually said it in the FAQs. Sorry there's no people of color representing the ethnic caucuses. There just wasn't enough room for them, right? Right, yes, there's people of color on there, but they weren't sent by the caucuses. There are queer folks and other leaders, but it didn't represent the institutions, the advocacy groups that have been in the struggle. So we have to be deeply suspicious of a process that actually acknowledges, well, we should have done better, we couldn't do better because we chose not to do better.
So I didn't say that my pronouns are she, her, and hers, so I'll say that now. Also, what I'm afraid of is fear itself, because it is fear that forces us to, it forces us to then live within the known, and stops us from taking risks. So that is what I'm most fearful of. And I invite us all to not be fearful, but to be willing to look at possibilities, and possibilities are out there. Tyler really did free me to say some of the things. I was not going to say anything about colonized faith that I had, but sharing Anna's story reminds me of all the options that were given to the conference through this process that Reverend Anna Bladel went through. But they were not willing to listen to those. I invite us to listen to those options. Jay has shared with us one of the options that we believe in simply because it is an option that is open, transparent, and it is offered to us by the people who we're talking about. It is by people of color. It is by queer people. It is by trans people. Immigrants are involved in it. Women are part of it. So to say that there is no room for those groups is almost like saying, like those sad eyes that Tyler was talking about. Yeah, we understand, but sorry, we will do what institutions do. I am afraid of fear itself. I'm also afraid of lack of transparency and or coded language. So many of us bought into the One Church plan because of the coded language. And we were unable to see past it. We all, not we all, but many of us looked at it and saw, oh, look, there is hope in that plan. And those of us who were saying, but look, there is code, and this is what it might really mean, our voices were shut. We could not, like Jay said, even our new plan is not getting the same traction that all the other plans are getting. Because that's how system is. The system promotes itself and stops or hinders or blocks the voices that are those other voices that say, no, wait, but there is another way. Please pay attention to those other ways and support the new plan and read more about the new plan and see how we can reimagine a church that will welcome all people, that will support all people, that will be live out the
My response comes from more ambivalence and sort of more of a Debbie Downer to that one, but that was cool. I was feeling pumped up by that. But I also think that I think that these new ideas that are emerging are still heavily anthropocentric, and I fear that they're not as inclusive as we need to be thinking, particularly in light of climate crisis. This is something that we're not talking enough about in our relationship to the earth. How are we changing our theological perspectives in relationship to ecology? And the way that we live is heavily dictated by the theology to which we subscribe. So when we're thinking about new things emerging, we need to think about the Earth Mother. I hate all this like camera stuff, but I was in a meeting with the Council of Bishops about a month, 2 months ago, something like that, and the conversation was on racism and colonialism. And so when I raised issues about heteropatriarchy and marginalization of LGBTQ persons, that was shut down. Bishops saying that we're here to discuss racism and colonialism. And so what scares me is that people are not making the connections here. And of course, it was an easy response for me as an indigenous person, because I just told you a moment ago that our people traditionally were very inclusive. We had very solid philosophical conceptions of how queer persons are integral parts of our community, of our people. But we still see those remnants, but it was heavily severed by colonialism that was imposed upon us through the church. And so if you can't make those connections, if leadership can't make those connections, then I'm kind of fearful of that.
All right, so I apologize. I know everybody hasn't had a chance to speak yet, but you guys are coming back after lunch, so don't worry. You'll get to run your mouth some more. I mean that in a nice way. No, but seriously, we're going to move on to our next part of our program. We've got some special guests and friends of ours that we've been working with from called Leap of Faith, and I'd like to invite Pastor Charles Strait to come on up and give the introduction for them. And you guys are free to go sit back down, and they're going to come up here. So, but thank you very much for our panel. But they're coming back. They're coming back.
It is my great honor to not introduce to most of you because you probably know them, but to bring up our next guests, David Brandon and Sue Laurie. They represent Leap of Faith, which is an organization that is seeking to help us maneuver through finding justice, finding ways that our group of the Reconciling Ministry here in Northern Illinois, we thought it would be very important to have a little bit of that conversation today. So please welcome Sue Laurie and David Brandon.
Thank you, everyone, for turning out today for this whole day of events. Thank you to the task force for bringing people in, such as who you have brought in. This has been really, really wonderful. You know, you plan what you think you might say, and then they just spur so many different thoughts in my mind. It's like, oh my gosh, don't worry, David, I'll leave you a couple of minutes. Thank you to Pastor Hannah and this church also for welcoming us here. It's a welcome I do not take for granted. Some of you know my name is Sue Laurie, and my wife needed to take a little break right now, Julie, but Julie's the one that funds my ministry also, as I've been able to continue in that, and we know that's a real privilege. But all of the trouble I've ever gotten into in the United Methodist Church has come because I asked the question, where can a gay person, where could a lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer person go to church this Sunday in their own town? And we have been oppressed and abused and scorned for asking that question. And people are surprised sometimes to find out we've had a hard time finding church in Northern Illinois Conference also, not just our home conference of Western Pennsylvania. So when we come to this leap of faith idea, and the idea of disaffiliation, I want to thank David Braden too, because he's been like almost light of my life lately with his enthusiasm for this. David and I chuckle because we both were staff members with Reconciling Ministries Network, and we both committed our lives, more than sad eyes, to working with that movable middle, working with progressives to bring the day when there would be truth-telling at the general conferences. And our confidence now for disaffiliation and inviting people to ask more questions and be more ready for that, we say, comes from our extreme failure at what we've been doing. We know all these ways, all these systems, all these things, like, well, just try this, and just do this, and just do this, and all of that. And we could smell the smell of the One Church plan long before other people could, because we have committed to this, and we have failed over and over and over. So we think it's time for a leap of faith, and the things that were said here today are just so beautiful. I'd like to remind people here also, I am a baby boomer. 1990 was 30 years ago. I just like to say that to baby boomers. David was 5. His whole lifetime in this denomination has been under the banner of discrimination. And let's wait for the next general conference. So when I did work for Reconciling years ago, I've been gone a long time, but long time ago, I would say to people, the split is not in the future. And they'd say to me, I'm too political and I'm too divisive and I'm all of this in Northern Illinois, and you're going to cause a split. Well, I was fortunate. As a volunteer at my very first general conference in Denver in 1996, nobody knew who I was. I just had an open the doors button on. And people would come up to me as delegates, unknown, with the open the door button, and say, I'm on your side, but I voted against you because I don't want the church to split. So my disagreement is not with the traditionals, it's with the progressives. The split's been going on for a long, long time. After every general conference, we lose people. We lose good, faithful LGBTQ people. We lose their family members. We lose a lot of boomers. In the 2008 general conference, when I was on staff and we went to Fort Worth, and we thought we could win, and we did whatever we did, and Northern Illinois was heavy involved with that. I have more to say about that. However, if you look at the photographs, the people who made up Mosaic, the people who were the young adults at that time, are largely gone from the United Methodist Church. Our parents group was incredibly active. And if you look at those pictures, some of them have died, and a lot of them don't go to church anymore. They don't go to Methodist churches. So as we consider that millennials are not going to put up with the hypocrisy of the protocols or the One Church plan or any of that stuff, I would like to also say some of the baby boomers and Gen Xers aren't putting up with it either. As you notice your funding pages going down, that the money's not being given at the rate, because when these faithful 70 and 80-year-old people are dying and they used to give so generously, and these millennials, and these people in their 20s, they don't give like people in their 70s. I'd like to conjecture with you, we never did. We who were in our 20s were never the replacement for the 70s and the 80s. The people in the funds you're missing are the people in their 50s and 60s that have some disposable income. We are also sick of the hypocrisy. So the leap of faith for me is, a kinder, gentler way to say disaffiliation, to invite you to think of something different, to know as reconciling employees, we got a little bump of a bunch of new reconciling congregations after every general conference. This is nothing new. The traditional plan is nothing new. There are no new laws. And the amount that it pains and grieves me when people are like, oh my God, look what they did, shows how much you haven't been paying attention. All we ever had in Western Pennsylvania is the traditional plan. That's all we ever had. And then we had code language, and we had don't ask, don't tell. And that don't ask, don't tell is great havoc on people like myself. And so it's nothing new. But what is new is the enforcement and some punitive laws for those old laws. So now what has happened, and the bishops got busy after all those years of nothing we can do, our hands are tied, is they got busy because now with the new
believed that the one church plan was going to pass, and then it didn't. And we're believe in, so that when the General Conference happens, we are in a much better position to say whether or not our values align with what the General Conference has or has not done. Because let me tell you, if they do something, great. We can pack our bags now and we can line up at the door, and at General Conference, we'll have a better idea of what door we can open and walk through into a great liberative justice. But if the General Conference does nothing and we're asked to wait again, that's another door that we know, and that's another way that we can help prepare ourselves to move forward. I want to say, too, that in our conference, even as a reconciling conference, we have not been immune from those sad eyes. We've had a culture within our conference of, don't ask, don't tell. And it's really only in recent memory that we've started to move a little beyond that, but not much. So even as a reconciling conference, there's a lot of work to be done for how we are actually a liberative, justice-seeking community. Because even if we pass the protocol and we get to remain in whatever remains, are we going to fall back on the status quo and just be tolerant of queer folks? Are we actually not just welcoming of queer folks, but do we actually believe in the sacred worth of all people, including queer folks? That's what I think the invitation of what disaffiliation discernment conversations are. No one has committed to actually leaving the denomination. It's having a conversation. So again, our next gathering is going to be on February 15th, 2020 at Northbrook United Methodist Church. It's going to start at 1 p.m. After, when Sue and I step down from here, we're just going to have some more kind of question and answer time on the third floor, and we're happy
How do you be so callous and not care about the people you left behind? stone around their neck and throw them in the ocean. And people remember that moment. Well, when I'm with the progressives, I like to say, that's my home conference. That delegate is from my home conference. And when you abandon us with your one church plan and feel good about yourselves, I don't understand that. And I participate, and I know some of it's my white privilege. I trusted this system long after I should have trusted this system, and I'm sorry. And my work with disaffiliation and helping people grieve this and still find ways of being Wesleyan is part of my repentance, not in an overly guilt-ridden way, but repentance in the turnaround, and I'm not going to do that anymore. So think of the times you've told folks, just move, just be here. We feel like you are mocking us when you say that to us.
One of the things that people ask, I think frequently, and even was asked of the panel here, is, where's the hope? Is there hope? And part of the way I turn that question around is, hope in what? Because for me, the United Methodist Church as a denomination is dead. So I don't have hope in this.
We are already losing people. What do you not see here? So it's time to have integrity and to be congruent, like our brothers and sisters have talked about in Zhao. We need to have integrity. So that's all I can say. If we're going to continue under the one church plan or the traditional plan, I have no integrity there, and I can't live that way anymore, and I don't want to end my career in some unfaithful, quote, church.
I join David in that hope. My hope is in Jesus. I want to mention to you, some of you who know me hear this all the time, I see the Holy Spirit at every general conference. I'm often in the hallways. There was the Holy Spirit that moment. That person came up to me and said, I'm on your side, but I didn't vote for you because I don't want the church to split. Like, they didn't know I'd be telling that story 24 years later. The Holy Spirit is at every general conference. And so I have the honor, the privilege, the wherewithal somehow, and thanks to Love Prevails also, to get to a lot of Council of Bishops meetings. So we have individual and group relationships with a lot of bishops. So I mention this because it's Tracy Smith Malone, who I went to seminary with and is a bishop elected out of this conference, this jurisdiction and this conference. So at the last Council of Bishops meeting, it was in Lake Junaluska, and during a little 5-minute break, when people were feeling like what David said, like everything's dead and falling apart, Tracy just came over to me real quick. We were classmates at Garrett, and said, if legislation can't produce an answer, like what should we do? And sometimes I don't know what to say either. So don't feel bad when you don't know what to say. But somehow God gave me these words that I said, Tracy, I think if we tell the truth, the Holy Spirit can work with that. As a progressive, as a Reconciling United Methodist, as a staff person on Reconciling Ministries Network, the middle, the progressives, whoever like that, we have never, ever approached a general conference by telling the truth about queer people. We have always compromised before we got there and hoped for compromise legislation. And so anyway, I didn't say all that to Tracy. All I said was, I believe if we tell the truth, the Holy Spirit can work with that.
Thank you all. And so we'll be up on the 3rd floor. Oh, sure. Do you want to pray for lunch?
All right, it's lunchtime. Let me give you a couple of directions. For those of you still looking for a bathroom, you just go straight to that door. Passing elevator, stairs, there's one on the hallway. And every floor that has a bathroom, so you can wash your hand, whatever, get ready. And those who need to use the elevators, go down straight. The lunch will be in the fellowship hall, which is just right below the sanctuary. So those who use the elevator, get down, make a right turn, go straight. And those who can use stairs, go stairs down.